It was a typical Monday morning in room 207 of Crestwood High. The air was thick with the usual buzz of excitement and grogginess that came with the start of a new week. Students shuffled into the classroom, some dragging their feet, others chatting with friends. The desks were arranged in neat rows, and a large chalkboard at the front of the room bore the day's lesson in neat white letters. It was a place where students either tried to stay invisible or made themselves known. But in this classroom, all eyes were usually on Mr. Matthews. The teacher, Mr. Matthews, had taught history at Crestwood for over a decade. He was the type of teacher who didn't tolerate nonsense and loved to make an example out of students who spoke out of turn. His lessons were structured, but his delivery was strict, sometimes sarcastic, with a heavy dose of irony. He wasn't the kind of teacher to get close to students, preferring to keep things professional. For most, this made him someone to fear, or at least respect. However, for one student, Jamal, Mr. Matthews was just another obstacle to get through each day. Jamal was a quiet boy, not one to draw attention to himself. He was the kind of student who kept his head down and did his work without complaint. But behind his soft-spoken nature, Jamal carried something powerful, a story that he rarely shared with anyone. Most of his classmates didn't know much about him beyond his grades or the fact that he kept to himself. For Jamal, the school day was just a routine, a means of getting through the hours until he could return home to the comfort of his family. But little did he know, today would be different. The bell rang, signaling the start of the lesson, and the students slowly trickled to their seats. Mr. Matthews, standing at the front, adjusted his glasses and began scribbling notes on the board. He had an authoritative presence, and his voice boomed across the room as he started discussing the topic for the day: U.S. history, the wars, the leaders, and the decisions that shaped the country. As usual, Jamal sat in the middle of the classroom, quietly listening. He was attentive, but didn't volunteer much in class. His mind often wandered to his father, who worked at a place most people couldn't even imagine, a place where high-ranking officials walked through the halls every day. Jamal had always been proud of his father, though he didn't often speak about his work. It was a part of his life that he kept private. He felt proud, but he also knew how unusual it sounded. Most kids couldn't understand what his dad did. They would think it was some kind of made-up story. So he kept it to himself. On this particular day, as Mr. Matthews droned on about the military and the U.S. government, Jamal's thoughts drifted again to his father. His dad wasn't like most of the fathers in his class. He wasn't just a regular worker. He was an important man, a man who played a role in protecting the nation, someone who worked with the highest levels of security. It was something that filled Jamal with pride, but it also made him feel different. His dad's job was hard too. Explained to others, and he didn't want to draw attention to it. But today, something changed. As Mr. Matthews continued, he asked the class to raise their hands and share their thoughts on the history lesson. The question was about leadership, about the role of the president in shaping the nation. Most students hesitated before answering, unsure of what to say. Jamal, however, felt a small spark of courage. Without thinking too much, he raised his hand up. Mr. Matthews called on him, expecting a typical answer from the quiet student. Jamal stood up slowly, his voice soft but clear. "My dad works at the Pentagon," he said. Almost hesitantly, the words left Jamal's mouth before he had a chance to second-guess himself. The Pentagon? It wasn't something he shared often, and he hadn't expected to say it today. But there it was. It wasn't the first time he had mentioned his father's job, but this time felt different. As soon as the words left his mouth, the room went silent. The students stopped whispering to each other. Jamal's classmates looked up from their notebooks, some raising an eyebrow, others exchanging confused glances. Mr. Matthews, who had been writing on the board, paused. He turned to face Jamal, his expression unreadable. "Really?" Mr. Matthews asked, his tone more curious than amazed. "Your dad works at the Pentagon?" Jamal nodded, still standing at the front of the room. His heart was pounding in his chest, but he didn't look away. He wasn't sure why he had said it, but once it was out there, he couldn't take it back. Mr. Matthews raised an eyebrow, and the class waited in tense silence. No one spoke. The teacher took a moment to gather himself, then smirked. He said, looking back at the class, "I'm sure your dad's a very important man, Jamal, but you know, it's not easy to believe such things." "The Pentagon, huh? What does he do there?" The skepticism in Mr. Matthews' voice was clear, and the students began to murmur. Some of them chuckled under their breath, while others exchanged looks. They didn't believe Jamal. It was a story too wild to be true. Jamal felt his chest tightened, but he didn't back down. He stood there, still facing the teacher, his eyes steady. He knew the truth. He didn't need anyone else to believe him. This was the moment when everything changed. Jamal stood there, his heart pounding in his chest, trying to hold his ground. He wasn't used to speaking up in class, but today was different. The room, now filled with whispers and skeptical glances, made him feel small, most invisible. But as Mr. Matthews smirked and the laughter started to bubble up around him, Jamal's resolve only grew stronger. "Yeah, he works at the Pentagon," Jamal repeated, his voice steady despite the unease creeping in. "He's part of the team that helps keep the country safe." The class fell into an uncomfortable silence. The teacher's amused expression lingered for a moment longer than necessary, and Jamal could feel the weight of the skepticism hanging in the air. The students' faces flickered with disbelief. Some of them openly chuckled, while others exchanged doubtful looks. Jamal could almost feel the invisible line being drawn between himself and the others, a line he didn't ask for, but seemed to have been given anyway. Mr. Matthews didn't hide his smirk. "So, your dad is some kind of high-ranking officer, right?" he asked sarcastically, leaning against his desk with an air of disbelief. "You're telling me he works with generals and top officials in Washington?" Jamal nodded again. He knew how it sounded, how it felt to say those words out loud. No one in this class had a father working in the heart of the U.S. government, least of all, a kid like Jamal. The truth was, he wasn't the one who had chosen to make his dad's job a spectacle. But he also wasn't going to back down. "I'm not lying," he said quietly, but with conviction. "My dad is a contractor at the Pentagon. He works on security stuff, the kind of work most people don't know about." But Mr. Matthews, clearly not convinced, chuckled under his breath. "Well, if he's really such an important man, maybe I should give him a call. I'd like to know how he got involved with someone like you." The class erupted into laughter, and Jamal felt the sting of the words cut deeper than he wanted to admit. He was used to being different. Jamal had always known that his background, his family, wasn't like that of his classmates. He wasn't ashamed of it, but the constant judgment made him feel like he didn't quite belong. He didn't want to be the kid with the weird dad, or the one whose story sounded too good to be true. But in that moment, it didn't matter. He was telling the truth. And even though it felt like the whole world was questioning him, Jamal wasn't going to back down. He had nothing to prove to anyone but himself. Mr. Matthews turned back to the class, addressing them with a half-hearted laugh. "Well, I think Jamal here might be imagining a little too much." "The Pentagon, huh?" A tone was dismissive, almost mocking, and Jamal could see the class falling into step. Some students rolling their eyes, while others snickered under their breath. It was all starting to feel like one big joke at his expense, but Jamal didn't care anymore. His father had always told him that people would doubt him, that there would always be those who questioned his story, his background, or his worth. But his father had also told him that it was never about convincing others. It was about standing firm in your own truth. Jamal's eyes briefly flickered to the clock on the wall, then back to his classmates. He was done defending himself. He wasn't going to beg anyone to believe him. His dad's work was important, no matter how ridiculous it sounded. And though the laughter still echoed around him, Jamal wasn't going to let it get to him anymore. He just had to survive the day. He just had to keep his head up and stay quiet until the bell rang. Because no matter how loud the laughter got, he knew the truth. And that would be enough. As Jamal sank back into his seat, his chest tight with frustration, he couldn't shake the weight of Mr. Matthews' words. The laughter from his classmates still echoed in his ears. But more than that, he felt the sting of doubt creeping in. He had never been one to stand out, and now, in front of the whole class, he had become the subject of ridicule. His classmates were still whispering behind their hands, sharing glances as if Jamal had told them some wild fairy tale. Mr. Matthews, however, seemed to enjoy his moment of triumph. His smirk lingered as he turned back to the lesson, clearly proud of the teaching moment he'd just created. He wasn't letting Jamal off the hook so easily. He pressed on, turning the conversation into something he could control. "Well, Jamal," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Maybe next time you'll bring in a picture of your dad at work, just to prove you're not making this up. Or better yet, why don't you give me his number? I'd love to hear about his important job myself." The class erupted in laughter once more, and Jamal could feel his face burning. It wasn't just the teacher anymore, it was everyone. The whole room seemed to be against him, laughing at the very idea of his father working in a place as serious as the Pentagon. The mocking wasn't subtle. Some students whispered that Jamal was trying to act special, or that he had been. Watching too many movies, Jamal's hands clenched into fists under the desk. He had never felt so small, so exposed. He wasn't one to cry or let his emotions show, but in that moment, the weight of the situation pushed against him, trying to make him shrink even further. The ridicule wasn't just about his father's job. It was about who he was, who his family was. But as Mr. Matthews continued to speak, something inside Jamal shifted. He realized something. They weren't laughing because they thought it was funny. They were laughing because they didn't believe him. They didn't believe someone like him could have a dad who worked in such an important place. Not, he realized, made them feel comfortable. It made them feel safe in their own little worlds, where kids like Jamal didn't belong in the same league as the people they saw on TV or in movies. In their minds, people like Jamal were meant to stay on the sidelines, invisible, easy to dismiss. But Jamal wasn't just going to sit there and take it anymore. His dad had taught him better than that. He wasn't a joke. His family wasn't a joke. The work his dad did wasn't a joke. His fists slowly unclenched and his mind cleared. He wasn't going to sit in silence while they decided what he could or couldn't be. Mr. Matthews and the rest of the class could laugh, but Jamal was done hiding. He wasn't going to beg for their approval. He wasn't going to explain himself anymore. He was going to stand firm. As Mr. Matthews moved on with the lesson, Jamal felt a new sense of resolve wash over him. He knew that there was no point in trying to convince them. He didn't have to prove anything to them. What he had to prove was to himself. And so he sat there, chin lifted just a little higher, shoulders a little straighter. He wasn't going to let their laughter drown out his truth. He didn't know it yet. But that moment would mark a turning point. It wasn't just about surviving the rest of the day, it was about something bigger. Jamal would learn that the strength to withstand ridicule didn't come from fighting back, came from standing tall in the face of it. From walking out of that classroom with his head held high, no matter what anyone said. He wouldn't let them define him, wouldn't let them take away his dignity. But for now, he simply sat there, enduring the next few moments of embarrassment, knowing that his truth was stronger than the laughter of anyone around him. The Mocking continued as Mr. Matthews, clearly enjoying the attention, decided to press on. He turned back to the chalkboard, writing down a new question on the board. But his eyes kept flickering back to Jamal, like he couldn't help but return to the story that he thought was so amusing. The class had calmed down somewhat, but the tension in the air was thick. Jamal could still feel their eyes on him, some of them whispering to each other. No doubt repeating the ridiculous story about his Pentagon dad. As the lesson dragged on, Mr. Matthews couldn't resist throwing in a few more comments at Jamal. "You know, kids," he said, making eye contact with the class. "There's a lot of imagination in this room today." First, Jamal tells us about his dad working at the Pentagon. Next thing you know, he'll be telling us his mom's the president. Who knows, right? Laughter erupted once again. The class had clearly bought into Mr. Matthews' performance. It wasn't just a teacher correcting a student, it was an adult mocking a kid. And that made it somehow more satisfying to the other students. Jamal's stomach churned with embarrassment, but he didn't respond. He just sat there, hands resting on the desk, trying to block out the noise. But the ridicule wasn't just coming from Mr. Matthews anymore. As the class settled back into their routine, Jamal overheard bits and pieces of the conversation around him. "Pentagon, huh?" Someone whispered. "Yeah, right. Probably just a story he made up to sound cool." Another voice chimed in. "His dad probably works at some fast food joint, and he's just trying to make it sound fancy." The whispers felt like arrows, each one finding its mark. Jamal kept his gaze forward, but inside, a storm was building. The more they laughed, the more it hurt. The more they doubted, the more he wanted to scream. "It's true. My dad really does work there." But he didn't. Jamal kept quiet, allowing the ridicule to wash over him. His fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles ached. He knew he could have tried to defend himself. He could have said something to shut them down, something to force them to listen. Kit could have told them exactly what his father did, how important his work was, but it didn't matter. The more he spoke, the more they would dismiss him. In the midst of all this, something inside him shifted. Instead of wanting to fight back with words or throw a tantrum like the others might expect, Jamal felt an overwhelming sense of calm. He wasn't going to argue with them. He wasn't going to convince them that his dad's job was real. He wasn't going to waste his breath. Instead, he'd let them think whatever they wanted. He realized that it wasn't his responsibility to change their minds. They could laugh, they could doubt, they could ridicule him all they wanted, but that didn't change the truth. Jamal's dad worked at the Pentagon. That wasn't a story. That wasn't a fantasy. That was reality. Jamal sat there quietly, deciding he would no longer engage. The more they poked fun at him, the more they revealed their ignorance. They didn't understand the weight of the work his father did. They didn't see the hours his dad put in, the sacrifices he made. Wouldn't understand it, not until they grew up, until they saw the world through a different lens. And until then, Jamal didn't have to convince them. With that resolve, a surprising calm settled over Jamal. He wasn't angry anymore. He was just detached. Detached from the mockery. Detached from the laughter. Detached from the need to explain himself. He had nothing to prove. Mr. Matthews continued his lesson, oblivious to the internal shift that had taken place in Jamal. But as the teacher droned on, Jamal knew that, in a way, he had already won. He had nothing to prove to anyone. No one could take his dignity from him. The words they said didn't define him. They were just words. He was stronger than their ridicule. He was stronger than their laughter. And for the first time, Jamal felt like he didn't need to defend his father's work, his background, or his story. He knew the truth, and that was all that mattered. Asterisk, the tension in the room was thick as Jamal sat there, trying to block out the noise of his classmates and the sharp sting of Mr. Matthews' dismissive remarks. He had grown used to the uncomfortable stares, the whispered comments, but today it felt different. It wasn't just about a boy claiming his father worked at the Pentagon had become something more personal. It was about respect, or rather, the lack of it. Jamal's mind raced, not with thoughts of retaliation, but with a quiet determination that something had to change. He had never been one for confrontation, but this was more than just schoolyard teasing. This was a challenge to his family, his identity, and his truth. He couldn't let it stand. Then, just as Jamal had resigned himself to the rest of the class period, the unexpected happened. The door to the classroom creaked open. The sound of footsteps was soft at first, barely noticeable over the low hum of chatter. But then, the class quieted. It wasn't just the ordinary sound of someone walking into the room, it was the kind of entrance that drew everyone's attention. Jamal didn't even have to look up at first. But then, as the room seemed to collectively hold its breath, he felt something shift in the air. He glanced up. His heart skipped a beat. Standing in the doorway was a man tall, confident, and dressed in a sharp, professional suit. His posture alone spoke of authority, the kind that commanded attention without trying. For a split second, Jamal's stomach twisted, wondering if this was just a dream or a sudden flash of hope. Then, with a calm but commanding presence, the man stepped into the room. The room fell into stunned silence. It was Jamal's father, the man who had spent years working in the high-security halls of the Pentagon, the very man who Jamal had spoken about just moments ago, the same man that his classmates had ridiculed him for mentioning. And now, here he was, standing in the doorway of room 207, exuding an undeniable confidence that no one in the room could ignore. Jamal's classmates sat frozen in disbelief, unsure of what to do or how to react. For a moment, no one moved. Even Mr. Matthews, who had been so certain that Jamal was exaggerating, stood there, his mouth slightly agape as he looked from Jamal to the man in the suit. Jamal's father didn't waste any time. He took a step forward, his voice clear and steady as he addressed the class. "Good morning, everyone. I'm Captain Lawson, Jamal's father. I'm here to speak with Mr. Matthews about a special project the Pentagon is launching that involves local schools." The shock in the room was palpable. Students exchanged wide-eyed glances, their earlier laughter suddenly swallowed up by the weight of reality. Jamal's father, the man they had laughed at, was real. The job, the Pentagon, the claim was all true. And now, in front of everyone, his father stood as a living proof that Jamal had not been lying. For Jamal, it was a surreal moment. He had imagined his father walking into his school before, but he never imagined it would happen like this, during the moment when he needed it most. There, standing before the teacher who had mocked him, was the embodiment of everything Jamal had known to be true, but had struggled to defend. Mr. Matthews, still stunned, wiped his mouth nervously and cleared his throat. I wasn't expecting," he stammered. Looking back and forth between Jamal and the man before him, Jamal could sense that Mr. Matthews was searching for words, but none seemed to fit. There was no sarcastic comment, no easy dismissal, just stunned silence. The teacher, usually quick to dismiss anything he thought was out of the ordinary, was now struggling to find a way to take back the ridicule he had thrown at Jamal. But it was too late for that. Jamal's father turned his gaze toward the class, his eyes scanning the students. His presence filled the room, and for a moment, Jamal felt a wave of pride wash over him. The embarrassment he had carried for so long seemed to vanish, replaced with something much stronger: respect. Not only from his father's presence, but from the realization that Jamal's truth had just been validated in front of everyone who had doubted him. "Mr. Matthews," Jamal's father said, his tone steady but firm, I understand that there might have been some misunderstandings about my son's statement earlier. I'm here now to clarify any doubts and share some important information about the work we do at the Pentagon." His words were not boastful, but confident in the way only someone who had worked in the high-stakes world of government could be. For the first time in what felt like hours, the class was completely still. The usual hum of teenage gossip replaced by a quiet reverence. Jamal watched his father speak to the class, and in that moment, everything changed. He wasn't just the boy with a fantasy story anymore. He was Jamal, the son of a man who had earned the respect of the very people who had once ridiculed him. And as Jamal stood there, watching his father speak, he realized something else. This wasn't just about proving a point. It was about knowing who you are and standing by it, no matter what anyone else believes. The room remained eerily silent, the atmosphere thick with the weight of what had just happened. Jamal stood frozen, his eyes glued to his father as he confidently addressed Mr. Matthews, the class, and everyone who had doubted him just moments before. There was no rushing this moment, no way to undo the stunned silence that hung in the air. Jamal's father was here, in the flesh, standing as the living proof of everything Jamal had claimed. And now, it seemed, there was no escape for anyone who had ridiculed him. Jamal's father didn't raise his voice, but there was something commanding about the way he spoke. His tone was calm, but filled with an undeniable authority. "I understand your skepticism, Mr. Matthews," he said, addressing the teacher with a subtle, respectful nod. "I also understand that it might have been hard to believe that my son could speak about something as significant as the Pentagon. But I'm here to tell you that the work we do is real, and it affects every one of us in ways you might not understand at first glance." Jamal watched the teacher, whose face had turned pale. Mr. Matthews was fumbling for words, unsure of how to respond. He had always prided himself on being the one who controlled the classroom, the one who made students feel small if they dared to step out of line. But now, he was the one shrinking back. There was no sarcastic remark he could use to brush this away. No way to dismiss the truth standing in front of him. "You see," Jamal's father continued, his voice unwavering, "what I do at the Pentagon might seem far removed from your everyday life, but it's not. The work we do ensures that every person in this country is kept safe, that our nation's security remains intact. It's not about fame or fortune. It's about responsibility and obligation I take very seriously." Jamal could see Mr. Matthews swallowing hard, his eyes darting between Jamal's father and the students in the room. The smug, dismissive teacher who had mocked Jamal just minutes ago was now trying to hold on to his composure. But the truth had already spoken for itself. Jamal's classmates were still frozen in place, their mouths agape. The whispers had died down, replaced by wide eyes and nervous glances. Some students were too stunned to even breathe. Others were unsure whether to apologize or keep their heads low in shame. Jamal, though, felt something shift inside him. The embarrassment that had once curled in his stomach, the sharp sting of laughter that had followed him for so long, was slowly dissipating. It wasn't just because his father was here. Now it was because, in this moment, he knew the ridicule was over. His dad wasn't just proving his story. He was standing up for Jamal, for his family, and for everything that they had worked for. As his father finished speaking, he turned toward Jamal, his gaze softening for a moment. "I hope this teaches you all something," he said, his voice filled with a quiet pride. "It's easy to mock what we don't understand, but it's important to remember that everyone has a story, some of which are far greater than what we can imagine from the outside." Jamal felt a wave of warmth flood over him. The truth had been spoken, not in words, but in the strength of his father's presence. It was a powerful moment of respect, not just from his father, but from the entire class, and even from Mr. Matthews, who was now silent. humbled by the realization that he had been wrong. The teacher cleared his throat and finally managed to speak, his voice softer than it had been all morning. I apologize, Jamal, he said, his voice laced with genuine remorse. I didn't mean to. Well, I should have known better than to question you. Jamal didn't respond right away. There was no need for words. He didn't need an apology from Mr. Matthews, nor did he need anyone to tell him he was right. He had already won. Not in the way that Mr. Matthews had been proven wrong, but in the way that Jamal had proven to himself that the ridicule of others could never define him. As Jamal's father nodded curtly, preparing to leave, he glanced at Jamal, giving him a look that said everything. In that look, Jamal saw a mixture of pride, understanding, and love, and unspoken acknowledgement that the moment had been his. It wasn't about the teacher or the class. It was about Jamal standing tall in the face of ridicule, no longer needing to explain or justify his family's place in the world. Mr. Matthews finally straightened himself, his face a mix of embarrassment and relief. I'll make sure your record is updated, he mumbled, his voice subdued. But Jamal didn't need the teacher's apology. He had something far more valuable than that, his dignity. As the bell rang, signaling the end of class, Jamal stood tall, his father by his side. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the need to shrink or hide. He had nothing to prove to anyone but himself. And when Jamal walked out of that classroom, he knew that nothing would ever be the same again. As the bell rang, signaling the end of the class, Jamal felt a subtle shift in the air. The tension that had weighed on him for so long, the quiet fear that always followed the ridicule, was beginning to melt away. His father's presence in the room had done more than silence the laughter. It had redefined Jamal's place in that classroom, and perhaps in the school itself. He wasn't just the quiet kid in the back anymore. He wasn't just the boy who was different. Jamal had become someone to be respected. Jamal's father, Captain Lawson, gave him a small approving nod before turning to leave the room. Jamal followed behind him, feeling the eyes of his classmates on his back. He could sense that the whispers had stopped, replaced by something else, something he hadn't expected: curiosity. As they made their way down the hallway, Jamal's classmates seemed to step aside, their eyes lingering on him with newfound respect. The typical teenage sneers were gone. There were no more sideways glances, no more quiet laughs behind his back. Some students even nodded at him as he passed, as though they were acknowledging something they hadn't understood before. It wasn't their words that changed, but their actions. They were seeing Jamal for the first time, not through the lens of their preconceived notions, but as someone who had his own strength. The same Jamal who had once quietly endured the teasing now walked down the hall with his head held higher. The weight of the ridicule replaced by the weight of something far more empowering. Truth, it wasn't long before a few of the students, those who had been closest to the laughter, approached him. Their faces were hesitant, but not in a mocking way. Jamal could feel the shift in their energy. They were genuinely curious, perhaps even ashamed of how they had treated him. "Hey, Jamal." One of them, a tall kid named Chris, called out nervously, his eyes not meeting Jamal's directly. I didn't know your dad worked there." That's pretty cool." Jamal nodded, giving him a small smile, though he didn't speak right away. He didn't need to. The apology was implicit in the way Chris spoke. Jamal had learned something important in that moment sometimes. Respect doesn't come in grand gestures or loud declarations. It often comes in the quiet moments of understanding, the subtle shifts in behavior, the nod of acknowledgement that says, "I see you now." A few other students, a couple of girls who had been part of the crowd that mocked him earlier, stepped forward. As well, one of them, Sarah, who had always sat near the front of the room, caught his eye. "I'm sorry, Jamal," she said softly, her voice sincere. "I didn't think." I didn't think about it like that. I shouldn't have laughed. Jamal's heart softened. He had always hated confrontation, especially in moments like these when it wasn't about anger or frustration, but something deeper, something about growth. "It's okay," he said quietly, his voice steady. "I didn't expect you to. Believe me, but I'm glad you do now." Sarah nodded, looking down briefly, as if reflecting on what she'd just said. Jamal didn't expect everyone to suddenly become his best friend. He didn't need that. What mattered was that the ones who had once ridiculed him now saw him for who he truly was, a young man with a story that deserved to be heard, not laughed at. As they reached the exit of the school, Jamal's father stopped to wait for him. The older man smiled warmly, clearly proud of how Jamal had handled himself. Jamal could feel the weight of the moment, the pride his father had for him. Not because he had been proven right, but because he had stood firm in the face of adversity, never letting the mockery turn him into something smaller. "You did well today," Captain Lawson said softly as they walked out of the building together. "I'm proud of you." Jamal glanced up at his father, his chest swelling with a mix of relief and gratitude. He didn't need anyone else's approval now. He had learned something about himself today that was worth far more than any apology or acknowledgement from his classmates. He had learned that no matter how loudly the world might laugh, his truth would always be his shield. And with that shield, he could face anything. As they stepped out into the late afternoon sun, Jamal felt a sense of calm settle over him. It wasn't just the end of the school day. It was the beginning of something new, a new chapter, not just in his life, but in the way he viewed himself. He had nothing to prove anymore, and as Jamal and his father walked down the steps of the school together, his future seemed a little less uncertain and a little more his own. The next few days felt different. The whispers that had once followed Jamal like a shadow were now replaced by a subtle, almost respectful silence whenever he walked through the halls. His classmates no longer avoided eye contact or exchanged snickers behind his back. In fact, they often stepped aside to let him pass, nodding in quiet acknowledgement. For the first time, Jamal felt like he wasn't just a background character. In his own life, he wasn't the quiet kid anymore. He was seen. Even Mr. Matthews, who had been so quick to mock him, seemed to change. The teacher's tone was softer, his approach more measured. He still held on to his usual authoritative presence. But there was a newfound respect in the way he interacted with Jamal. The sharp sarcasm had disappeared, replaced with a kind of professionalism that Jamal had never expected. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The teacher's apology, though not spoken outright, was evident in his every action. One afternoon, as Jamal sat in the library, lost in the pages of a book, he felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find Chris, the same student who had mocked him earlier, standing awkwardly by the table. "Hey, Jamal," Chris said, scratching the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable, but trying to bridge the gap. "I just wanted to say that. I don't know. I think you handled everything pretty well the other day. That must have been tough." Jamal looked up at Chris, studying his face. It wasn't the usual friendly, carefree expression that most students wore, but something more genuine, an apology without words. Something had changed in Chris, too. Jamal nodded slowly, his lips curving into a small smile. "Thanks, man," he said. "It wasn't easy, but it needed to be done." Chris hesitated before sitting down across from him. "I get it now," he said quietly. "I guess I never really thought about the kind of pressure you might face, you know? The stuff people don't always see." Jamal nodded again, appreciating the rare vulnerability that Chris was showing. "It's cool," he said, his voice softer now. "A lot of people don't understand what's at stake, not until they're shown." Chris gave a sheepish grin, then added, "You know, I was talking to Sarah and the others, and we all realized that we were kind of wrong about everything. Not just about your dad, but about you too. I think we all owe you an apology." Jamal wasn't used to receiving apologies, and it felt strange hearing it, but not unwelcome. He had been taught to endure, to demand an apology. Yet, in this moment, he felt a quiet sense of justice, not in the way it had come, but in the realization that things could, and did, change. "I don't need an apology," Jamal said after a pause. "I'm just ... glad things are different now." After a few moments of silence, Chris gave him a nod of understanding. "Yeah, me too." The bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, but Jamal didn't feel the usual rush to leave. There was a calmness in his chest, an unexpected peace. He gathered his books slowly, the familiar weight of his backpack feeling different, heavier, but not in a bad way. It was the weight of being seen, of being acknowledged for who he truly was. As Jamal walked out of the library, his mind drifted back to that moment in the classroom. His father, standing there in front of everyone, making the truth undeniable. Had been a pivotal moment for Jamal. But what mattered now wasn't just the teacher's apology, or the changed attitudes of his classmates. What mattered was how he had changed within himself. He didn't need anyone else's approval, he realized. He had his father's pride, his own self-respect, and the quiet strength that came from knowing who he was. No longer did he need to explain or justify his family's place in the world. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He just had to keep moving forward. As he walked out the doors of Crestwood High, Jamal didn't feel the weight of judgment bearing down on him. Instead, he felt free. He knew that from this day forward, he would never shrink back from the truth of who he was or where he came from. The journey had just begun, and for the first time, Jamal felt ready to face whatever came next. Head held high, the world might still not fully understand him, but he understood himself, and that was enough.